podcast, Blue White Breakdown. It's Wednesday, final Wednesday, if my math is correct, August 26th. In August, Bob Flounders, Jake Aferiat here to talk Penn State football. Jake, it's not officially Marshall Week. That is coming right around the corner. And Penn State fans, we're going to go to two podcasts a week, beginning with the Marshall game. We'll be going Monday noon, hopefully, and then Thursday live at noon, subject to change depending on schedules. But that is the plan with Bob, me, and Jake. Jake, let's just talk. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's just talk. It's been really an intriguing August with a new coach, a new staff. They have been very gracious and accommodating with their time, whether it's watching practice, or availabilities with Matt Campbell, his coordinators, his assistant coaches, his prominent players. It's been one of the busier months on the beat that I can remember, and I've been around way too long. But I wanted to, because you're still a newbie, you're still a rookie. You're about a month in, but just your impressions of kind of this week, because we had an availability earlier this week with Matt. Ikeka Malloy, the defensive line coach, some very prominent players. I'm sure I'm forgetting some people. But your impressions of this busy August, what you've learned, and what were some of your takeaways from the most recent availability?
Yeah, so the thing that I think the two things that Matt continues to stress are consistency and culture. And he talks all the time about guys not just putting up one or two good practices, but really stacking them on top of each other. And can they do that on a consistent basis? And I think some of the names he's continued to highlight, James Peoples and Quentin Martin at running back continue to get a lot of praise.
Mm-hmm.
Linebacker Kel Brazina, I think he said, has been playing some of the best football that he's seen him play, and that includes in their time at Iowa State. Um, he said that Tony and Max and a few other guys are kind of rounding into form now. So again, I think it's a lot of the usual suspects, but the thing that stood out to me is just how high on kind of the entire team he is. When somebody asked him who were kind of the MVPs or the standouts from camp, I think Matt spoke for like 4.5 minutes and
Very
basically named
inclusive.
everyone
He's
on the
very
roster.
inclusive with praise.
Yeah. And he spoke for like 4.5 minutes, named like
Yeah.
everyone on the roster in some capacity. And listen, on some level, yeah, maybe you expect the head coach to say
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
but he didn't have to go out of his way to single out everyone, and he did. And I think that says a lot. And again, they had a second scrimmage in
Mhm.
Beaver Stadium this past Saturday. I don't know if they quite ran the 90 plays or whatever it was that they
Mhm. Yeah.
ran in the first one.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, again, he continues to praise Rocco Becht. Says that he's performing at an elite level. Um, obviously tight end is a big thing for them, wide receiver. So again, I think there's a lot to be encouraged by. Again, we heard from a lot of the defensive linemen and defensive line coaches yesterday. And I think that's an area here where, it's been kind of a fascinating group to follow because, again, under James, there weren't these 300-pound guys up front, but yet they were developed in a way that still got them to the NFL, whether it was Abdul Carter, Yetur Gross-Matos, whomever it might have been, you know. So now the tenor of the defensive line has shifted where, a couple of weeks ago, Ryan Clanton, the offensive line coach, said when he sees guys like Keanu Williams and, Siale Taupaki walking down the hallway and some of these other 300-pounders, he
Yeah.
gets out of the way.
Yeah.
So, I think that that's an area where, and, Rich Scarcella asked Matt about generating pressure and rushing the quarterback and how they're able to do that. And I think Matt said practicing in the rain last week for the first time kind of helped them do that because you get into a lot of long down situations. So I think that's something that'll be interesting
Yeah.
to see. Yeah, and again, Bob, obviously you talked to Max Granville yesterday and, a few others. What was kind of your takeaway from,
Well,
that
let's
side of the ball?
sure. So a couple things about the defensive line that just to so what I would say is having seen so the edge rushers are a lot similar to James's edge rushers. That's not where it's different. It's different inside at defensive
Sure.
tackle
Yeah.
where they've had. If you look at the transfers that they've brought in, there are a couple of young guys, but the most prominent transfers are guys that are experienced. They're all well over 300 pounds. There were a lot of times on James Franklin's Penn State defenses that they had some defensive tackles that were big, but they also had guys like Zane Durant who played at closer to 285 or 290, and they weren't asking Zane Durant to occupy two blockers and free up the linebackers. They did a little bit of everything inside. They weren't nearly as big as these guys, but it was, they could get some pass rush inside if they needed to. This team, when it comes to the pass rush, and I think that's what Rich Garcella was kind of getting at is there isn't many. I don't think there's going to be, unless they kick one of the edge rushers inside on like 3rd and 10, like Ike Eziagu, who's close to 275. It's going to be hard for them, I think, to really pressure the quarterback. So it's really going to become, well, will the blitz get home or will the edge rushers get home for that? But I do think it's fascinating, their commitment. He mentioned a player that he coached last year at Iowa State, Dominique Orange. I think his nickname was the Big Citrus. He was literally like 350 pounds, played in Orange. But he's in the NFL now, and at Iowa State, they were looking for their defensive tackles to, hey, let's free up the backers and Marcus Neal, the safety that's hovering, to make all the tackles. We're just trying to get those guys clean. And I think that's what we're going to see from this defense when it's not obvious passing situations, especially 1st and 2nd down, especially against teams that have good offensive lines. But to circle back to the defensive tackles one more time, I know for a fact, Jake, that if it's Siale Taupaki and Keanu Williams starting, they will be not only the oldest starting defensive tackles in Penn State history, they might be the oldest starting defensive tackles in FBS history. And I say that only because both of them have either been injured or whatever it has been. But I think they're both looking at their 6th, 7th, or 8th years. Both Ikeka Malloy and Matt have been very encouraged by how they practiced the last couple of weeks. But it's rare to see guys. I mean, those are some grown men in the defensive line room. You don't see any peach fuzz on those guys. Those guys are big boys. They know why they've been brought in, and they are experienced. And I think the younger guys in that room have some great leaders to learn from.
Absolutely. And, I think Siale Taupaki, especially, we heard yesterday, he started his career out as an offensive lineman, played on that side of the ball for 2 or 3 years at UCLA. And then Ikeka Malloy sat him down, had a conversation with him, and Ikeka Malloy saw the vision of, hey, this is, longer term. I think you've got a future here on the defensive line. And so he made the shift 2 years ago. And I asked Ikeka, does he still play like an offensive lineman who's been converted? And he said, yeah, a little bit, but we're trying to kind of get that out of him so that, he plays, more vertically, more physically, more violently, rather than just kind of standing there and absorbing pressure like he did on the offensive line. So, I think that was something that, was interesting to hear about, and just, the differences, Siale said, offensive line is a lot more sort of technical and technique based. Defensive line a lot of times can be a lot more sort of brute strength and physicality and things like that. So, I think that was definitely, some interesting insight to glean there. And yeah, to your point, I think it's a matter of, those guys simply just take up a lot of space. I think you wrote it, Bob. What, they come in at like 650 something
23
pounds?
pounds, I think, unofficially, depending on whether they had breakfast or not, Jake.
Yeah.
It might be more.
And yeah, so again, not only are they the oldest D tackles in Penn State history, they might be some of the biggest.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
again, I think, the early games are going to be key, I think, for them to, get used to what, Matt wants to do and to give us early looks at kind of the defense and see, okay, what can it do, kind of coming into Big Ten play, and can these guys, get into a rhythm early where, like you said, they can free up the linebackers, they can free up, defensive backs, whomever it might be. So yeah, I think that was interesting because I think that's an area and a side of the ball that Penn State has always prided itself on. And
Hmm.
is one that I think is important to this team's success. Even if the offense ever struggles, I think defensively, with between Danton Lynn, bringing in his system,
Hmm.
some of these guys having played for Danton, some of these guys having played for Ikeka, Christian Smith is a Matt Campbell guy. He played for Matt, he coached with Matt. So I think there's a lot of that there on the defensive side of that continuity and sort of knowing what that standard should be. So
Jake, as we move along here on the blue white breakdown on the final Wednesday, yes, I just checked. This is definitely the final Wednesday, I believe. Hopefully, let's hope. Yeah, it is. I think. Yeah, it is in August. Um, let's just we can circle back to defense, but on the offensive side, I think last week on our podcast we talked about, without so much saying it, but they actually kind of said it, if everyone is relatively healthy, we know who the starting five is going to be on the offensive line, right? The way that they talked about them, it's pretty. And again, on Tuesday, it's Malachi Goodman and Anthony Donko at tackles, Malachi on the left side, Trevor Bohr, Cooper Cousins at guards, Trevor on the left side, Brock Riker, the Texas State transfer, is the center. I think Dom Ruli's still beat up, and I don't know. They've been using guards to kind of get reps at center in case anything happens to Brock. So we know. I think we know that, and I think the way that he talked about Siale and Keanu, uh, yesterday, they are the starting defensive tackles. Like Ikeka wants to play about five of them. Armstrong Nodim is another name to know, but he's just a baby. He's only like 305 or 310. He's just a little. He still has pounds to go and years to go to catch up to those guys. But I do think, Jake, I don't know how you feel about it, but it's I think once you get past Carson Hansen, who returned to practice yesterday, I think he had been held out. He is the guy if he's healthy. But it's been kind of presented that it's been in Quentin Martin, and James battling for number two. As August has played out, and the way that they've been talked about, and the way that Savon Huggins has talked about, I think they like all three. I would be surprised if James Peoples is not the second running back in the game. I know they mentioned Cam Wallace as a fourth running back, but look, unless there's injuries, you only play a fourth running back unless you're just waxing somebody in the fourth quarter, or C, you're getting waxed in the fourth quarter, and I don't think Penn State fans are ready for that conversation. So it's three backs that'll play if they're healthy. It really feels to me like James Peoples is probably the first guy in off the bench. I think Quentin Martin has made a lot of progress. He's added weight, but that's the way it feels like. That's how it feels to me. I don't know if you feel that way, but sometimes by the way that they bring them up and how they talk about them. For me, when he started talking about when Matt started talking about how he excelled in pass protection, I think that was the kind of the missing piece, because he talked about, hey man, like you can't play if you can't do all three. I really felt like that was him telling us that he is, after Carson, he is the most ready guy to be on the field. How do you feel about that?
yeah, and I talked to Carson last week,
Mm-hmm.
and he said that the only way you see the field as running back is if you protect the quarterback and protect the ball. And again, for as good as Quentin was in the bowl game last year, for as much talent as he
Yeah.
has, and listen, we've heard stories. They said in any other year, Quentin Martin could easily be a wide receiver on this team. It's just that they have Brett Eskleton and Chase Sowell,
Yeah.
in that spot.
Yeah.
That's how good of a receiver he is. And I think that again is an added threat that maybe Penn State hasn't had in the last couple of years. So certainly, I think you'll see Quentin Martin on the field plenty. But yeah, I think in terms of what they're trying to do offensively, if you can add somebody like James to the mix, who's a good blocker, in addition to the offensive line, in addition to guys like Rapp or Ben Bramer at tight end, who are good blockers too, I think that opens up the offense and creates a lot of different, versatility and multiplicity, as Matt says. And I don't know if Michael Keaton's paying him to say that, but
I
I
caught
think
the reference. I don't know that everyone on this podcast did, but I caught that movie reference.
And yeah, but I think that versatility and that depth certainly, gives them a lot of options on offense in terms of what they want to do. And again, James Peoples, he didn't light it up at Ohio State, partly because he was behind Travion Henderson, but I think he averaged 5.5 yards a carry, when he was used. So he's an efficient runner. He knows what he's doing. He's played in the Big Ten before. Not that Quentin Martin hasn't, obviously. But, I think that's something where, you see the sample size and the body of work, you see what's been said. And yeah, again, I think the competition between the two of them is pretty close. And, in talking to Savon Huggins and a lot of these guys, it sounds like, they both do a lot well. But I think that, and you've written about it, Bob, that element of pass blocking and, protecting Rocco, I think, is so important and so paramount, given the injury history there, given what they're trying to do. That, yeah, I think certainly early in the season, you could see James more, but things could change. I mean, like you said, Quentin's put on weight. We've said Quentin's a good receiver, so there are going to be ways for him to get on the field. And, if this running back race is as close as, Savon Huggins says it is, it could be hey, he had a great week this week, but, the next week it's the other guy. So I think it'll be fascinating to watch. But yeah, for the season opener, if they're going to run, two running backs, I think it'll be James Peoples. But, the other interesting thing, and, I heard you ask, Bob, is, Carson Hansen last week, I think you said he finished with 5 straight 100-yard games at Iowa State last year. And obviously that's a lot of wear and tear. But, I think Carson said that's sort of the cost of doing business as a running back. You're going to get used a lot. You're going to get banged up. And so they know they want to try to use, all 4 of these guys if they can, and keep a guy like Carson healthy for Big Ten play, for the bigger games. So I think that running back race, I think, is going to be fascinating to follow.
Yeah, Jake, I think as much as Carson would like to have his first 1,000-yard season, the circumstances around the Iowa State final 4 or 5 games dictated that for them to win, he was going to have to just get a ton of carries. Rocco was, I think, in pretty significant pain with he had 2 injuries. I'm not sure which hurt more, but it was a lot for him just to get up, suit up, and get on the field. And they just had to win with a different style. He was more of a game manager than maybe a threat to throw the ball. And the result was that Hansen got the rock. And I think the preferred attack this year will be 10 to 15 carries a game for the starting tailback. The backup gets a couple carries, maybe the third guy gets some, and the quarterback can throw it 25 to 30 times, and they can manage it that way. But that is not easy to do, in any conference. And for him to do that, I think he was a little bit beat up, but I think he's one of the guys I'm really excited to watch is Carson Hansen, because I just think that he's got unique size and movement skills for somebody that's, I think they list him at 6'2" or 6'1". He, much like Quentin Martin, he's a big back, not just in terms of weight, but also in terms of height. And you don't usually see that anymore. The more surface area they have, the more hitting area they have. So I'm very excited to see how he plays. I want to see who establishes himself at number 2. But Jake, I wanted to go back to the defensive side, and I wanted to just get your thoughts on one thing. It's pretty clear to me that if I had to rank the team's strengths, there's probably 3 or 4 positions that are in the conversation. To me, if you lump the secondary together, the corners and the safeties, they are the clear number 1 if they're all healthy, just because of the talent and the depth at both positions. When you have a guy like Jamison Patton, who knows how to play safety, had made some starts last year. He's not necessarily going to be one of the first guys you see at the safety position. And to hear how Matt has talked about a number of different players now that Jeremiah Cooper is back practicing, right? He thinks the world of Marcus Neal. Jamison Patton, another Iowa State guy, can help them if need be. But I mean, you also have Zion Tracy, who can now play safety. Um, the accelerated, I don't know, surprising, the accelerated development of Josiah Zayas, who is clearly going to play, and Matt talked about him again on Tuesday. I'm not sure what his role's going to be, but those are the names you keep hearing at safety, and then at corner at various times. He's talked a lot about Zion, but the idea is for Zion to be the nickel player, play some safety. He can line up outside. Darius Dixon, who was great last year late, is back. He was back on the practice field. He's another guy, that they really like. But the one, and then yesterday, what he said about Audavian Collins, really, he praised a lot of players. He went way out of his way to talk about all the great things that Audavian Collins has done for this team in the preseason. He was really good as a starter last year, but he really, really went out of his way to talk about all the things that AC has done. In addition to being the fastest player, he can also be a gunner on punt coverage. But it's kind of reading between the lines, I think, when you don't hear a name mentioned, it could be for a lot of reasons. I think in this case, it's because I'm getting the sense that I've heard that Jameer Joseph, who's in his second year, I don't know that he's 100% right now. I'm not positive, but he kind of missed the that wonderful MVP conversation. He was one of the names that was not necessarily mentioned. I don't think it's because they don't like Jameer Joseph. I think there's a ton to like about him. I'm just wondering where he is at physically, because he would fit in as a top 4 corner. He keeps saying he's going to move Zayas around. That's a signal that maybe if he can play the nickel and Cooper can play the nickel, that maybe Zion's going to be playing more corner early in the season if that's the case. That's one of the things that I kind of deduced from Matt Campbell's lengthy praise-a-thon yesterday for MVP candidates. And I'm sure all of it's deserved. I'm just impressed his recall of not only all those names, but also the details about what they did at Iowa State 2 years ago, or what his first meeting with one of these guys maybe in the offseason. He knows his roster cold. But that's one area. I think the secondary is a strength. But I think early in the season, it could look a little bit different. And the more I hear the name Zayas come out of coaches' names, I am pretty sure in these first 3 games especially, at some point, either in the second quarter, third quarter, we're going to see a lot of him. He's one of the players, along with Marion Jackson, that I think, for me, I'm eager to see early in the season, because they're the 2 names that have popped as true freshmen, and that's the time to play them. Who are some of the guys maybe you're really looking forward to see, especially in the first 3 games, beginning with Marshall?
Yeah, again, I think a lot of those guys that you mentioned, I think the encouraging thing is, you look at a kid like Darius Dixon, who's, I think, been one of the most universally praised,
Yeah.
defensive backs on this team, since practice started and everything like that. And, again, he played in all 13 games last year as a true freshman.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not like the moment is suddenly going to be too big for him. And I think having young guys who have game experience, again, if Jameer Joseph is banged up, Jameer played last year, got his opportunities. So, I think some of those young guys, like you said, Josiah Zayas comes from New Jersey. And, I know, talking to some of my high school football reporter friends at NJ.com, where I came from, they said this is a kid who was a little bit of a diamond in the rough, had, showed a lot of great flashes, had some games where maybe, there were some struggles, but that it's clear why this kid is on, a Power 4 football roster. And, I think, again, when you have, younger underclassmen who are expected to be impact players right away, thankfully they do have a little bit of runway and they do have these non-conference games to get up to speed, to get up to the feel for, what college football is like, because it's a totally different animal than, high school, regardless of, how good or what level they were playing at. Yeah, so I think certainly on the defensive side, I think, those two guys that you mentioned, um, I think the other thing too with the defense is, again, Max Granville is somebody who's coming back. Again, he's technically only a redshirt sophomore, but it feels like he's been at Penn State,
Yeah.
for a lot longer than that.
Mhm.
I think fans are chomping at the bit to see what he can do. Can he get back to the form and the potential that I think a lot of people expect? And again, his name is one that we haven't heard a ton. I mean, we heard it a little bit yesterday. Um, so people can kind of do with that info what they will. But yeah, I think a lot of the guys that you mentioned, Bob, are some of the same ones that, I think I'm looking forward to seeing, that, I'm expecting to kind of make an impact right away, whether it's on the stat sheet, whether it's simply, just hitting their assignments, doing what they're supposed to do. Um, I think it'll be fascinating to see kind of how this all develops. And again, I know you've talked to Terry Smith a lot. I know you've talked to Dan Lynn a lot. Those are two guys who understand what it means, who understand, the task ahead of them. So yeah, I think there's no doubt that this is a group that's going to be well coached, that's going to be prepared. It's now a matter of, like Matt has always stressed, can they execute? And he said it's different going from practice and executing in practice to executing in a game, and everybody's got to up their level. So, I
Mhm.
think can they do that? I think you'll get a sense for that early on.
Yep. All right. Before we get out of here, you wrote something about it. Matt Campbell talked about it. Um, I'm not sure how this year Matt and his staff will handle captains. I mean, there's a lot of ways they can go. Permanent captains, week to week, big number, small number. Not really sure, but I feel like I feel pretty good, Jake. I feel pretty good that three names that are firmly at the top of the list: uh, Anthony Donko, Rocco Beck, Tony Rojas. The way that he talked about Aldavian Collins, I don't know. I feel like that could have been signaling, but anyone else you think, and they're not always seniors, but usually juniors,
Yeah,
seniors. Those are your captains. Anyone else you want to throw their name into the ring or the hat as potential captains on the 2026 Penn State team?
yeah. So like you said, so last year at Iowa State, Matt and the staff did week to week captains. So they didn't name captains for the seasons. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
obviously at Penn State, it was Drew, Zane Durant, a few other guys for the duration of the season.
Yeah.
Again, you would know better than I would, Bob, when the last time Penn State had week to week captains was, not single season captains. It's probably been a little while.
I think Sean
Um,
Clifford was like a 3-year captain, but he was at Penn State for 12 years. So
yeah,
that's not
exactly.
that big of a compliment. But keep going.
Um, but yeah, I think Tony is an obvious choice. I think we've said he is the X factor on this defense. He's one of the key returners. Donko, again, I don't know if they would go another offensive lineman, but with the way they've talked about Cooper Cousins, I think
Yeah.
Cooper's another name
Mhm.
who certainly, could
How
be in
about
the
how
mix.
about Trevor? How about Trevor Bohr, the guy that's played a lot of football for Matt, and maybe he. I think wasn't it Mauser who said he might be the MVP at camp? Wasn't it last week? He could be a
Yeah.
sleeper. He could be a sleeper candidate to be captain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then again, a guy maybe like a Marcus Neal or a Zion
Yeah.
Tracy,
Yeah.
I think two guys on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, again, we'll see like if, one of the skill position guys, whether it's Hanson, whether it's one of the wideouts, I don't know. But my guess is it's, probably going to be, I think Rocco's a safe bet. I think Tony's a safe bet, and then beyond that, Matt said they'll have a decision before the season starts. We're getting up to it because I think the season starts in 10 days. Um, so, but I think that that's something that people care about. And, the other interesting thing that's changed is, again, for a long time, the number zero similar to sort of the captaincy. 0 was a badge of honor here. Whether it was Jonathan Sunderland, whether it was Don DeLuca, whomever it might have been, there was significance to the number 0. Obviously, new regime that has changed a little bit, so that's going to be Jameer Joseph's number. But yeah, I think the captaincy is something that still means something to a lot of people. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch and keep an eye on. And listen, if they go game by game captains, given all the transfers that they brought
That's
in,
the way to go to me. I think that's how he's got to do it. But we'll see. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So yeah, I think given all the transfers, especially from Iowa State,
Chase Soul is also 0. Just so you know.
Oh, okay. Yep. But yeah, so I think game to game is probably what they're going to do, which again is going to be a little different for Penn State fans and for the players. But I think a lot of those names are deserving, and I think that's an easy way to honor them and make sure nobody gets left out. So.
Yeah. All right, right before we get out of here, I'm just going to ask. I'm not asking for a reveal, but it's coming soon. Jake, do you have in mind for the regular season what you're going to predict for Penn State's 1-loss record? I'm, again, not revealing anything, but are you still going back and forth on some numbers?
Yeah, I think there's 2 games that I think I'm a little bit undecided on. I think
Buffalo is one, I think, right? Buffalo, you're not sure if they can pull that one out. And what's the other
one? Buffalo and Wisconsin. No, listen, I think the USC and the Michigan games, for me, I think are the 2, deciding factors and, how this season is going to go. And I think they're really going to set the tone. And obviously with USC being the whiteout, I think that puts all the pressure on Penn State. Again, especially with a lot of the narratives around Lincoln Riley and his performance in big games. Again, Dantlin worked at USC, so I'm sure there will be some rivalry at stake there. But I think that's one game. And then again, Michigan, Kyle Whittingham did a hell of a job at Utah. It's a little bit like Matt in that sense where, he won with not a lot necessarily a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So he's proven himself to be a great coach. So, Penn State, I think, hasn't won at the Big House in.
They won in the COVID year, so it doesn't count. I'm not counting that win. That was in Jim Harbaugh. They kind of like forfeited the last couple games because they said everyone.
Yes. Yeah. So I think those are the 2 games. Obviously, I think that everyone is circling. How I'm leaning in those 2 games, I'm not going to give that away just yet. But those are the 2 games that I have circled the most.
Jake, it sounds like you have Penn State penciled in for a W at Washington.
Yeah, I think I do.
Ooh, I cannot wait to get in touch with Washington's head coach after this podcast for bulletin board material. That's going to be a good game. I'm just kidding. But I think that is a game that is going to be, especially a little bit later in the year. I don't think they've ever been out to that part of the country, at least not to play the Huskies. That's a game that I'm fascinated by. But yeah, there's about 3 or 4 games I think you could make
and then listen,
either way for it.
Yeah, and then listen, like Minnesota's given them fits in the past. Could that be a potential trap game? Minnesota's won at Beaver Stadium, I'm pretty sure, if memory serves.
That was 99. Yeah, that was the 99 game that derailed LeVar Arrington.
But then, or in 2019, whatever it was, when Penn State lost at Minnesota.
Yeah.
And again, PJ Fleck's a great coach, so I think that's a trap game. Again, so I think there are there are a lot of ways to read the schedule. Everybody talks about how easy it is, but at the end of the day, they've got to execute, and they've got to play the teams in front of them. So we'll see.
Penn State fans, he could say 10-2. He could say 9-3. I think there's an outside chance, very outside. He's thinking 12-0. I don't think so. I don't think he would do that. But I think he's torn between the numbers 8, 9, and 10. That is my deduction. We'll have, I think, at some point we'll have our picks online out there somewhere, and our game predictions are coming starting next Thursday morning. So that's some other stuff to look forward to. It's almost Marshall game week, but Jake, good chatting with you. My only advice to you is this is going to be one of your final, in theory, free weekends, hopefully, for a little bit. The bye week I think comes after the Michigan game, so that's a good chunk of time. So hopefully you enjoy yourself this weekend. You don't get drawn into anything that's too. I guess you don't have to do any hard work. Hopefully the heavy lifting for you is done by Thursday. And you can get Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to yourself. I know you recently settled in State College. I'm sure that was not easy. So if anyone deserves a little time off, hopefully it's you. But any final thoughts here on this live Blue White Breakdown podcast?
No, I mean, yeah, we covered, I think, a lot of ground. I think the thing that I'm keeping an eye on is availability reports heading into the first game. We've heard a lot about some of these guys being a little bit banged up, haven't necessarily gotten the full extent of things. We've heard about some guys coming back from practice. So I think that first availability report is going to be pretty indicative of, where this team stands. So.
Yeah, again, I mean, it is, but let's with a grain of salt. Nothing against Marshall, but they are up against it.
About 30-something.5 point favorites.
It's 24.5. It opened at 24.5. The total I think is 58. Not that I follow betting trends, but I do think that even if they are a little banged up, I would maybe not. I don't know that I'd be in a hurry to play those guys, but we're gonna get down that road, I think, next week. Jake, always a pleasure chatting with you. Enjoy this weekend coming up, and then it's time to lock in. Hey guys, thanks to listening to the live podcast. I think we will also have something out on YouTube at some point. Well, we are live, but I think we'll have something out on PennLive as well. Good chatting with you guys. Don't forget, noon next Monday for our next Blue White Breakdown.